Hello, good evening. This is Andy from True Blue Quilts. Thank you for joining me on, and I trimmed them so that the centers are off center. That's where the dancing name comes from, and I'm ready to sew them in rows. So I'm just gonna do that. There's no rhyme or reason to these rows in terms of how to piece them together. There's nothing to line up, so I'm just putting them right sides together and starting to sew. Once you get your blocks done, the quilting process goes pretty quickly to, you know, it's kind of that snowball effect. And then you're ready to hurry up and get things finished, so you work on the project a little more often because you know, the end is in sight. One thing I am that you can do, since you can turn these blocks around however you want, you'll notice that some of those seam edges are pretty narrow. So I'm going to turn my fabrics around so that I have a wider strip of fabric. I'm sewing on a smoother surface when I start, so I'm putting the bigger fabric on the bottom and keeping that narrow seam when I start. Yes, I have a narrow seam at this end on the yellow piece, but the sewing machine will handle that better at the end of the seam than trying to start with that, especially if it were underneath where I couldn't see what was going on with my needle. So we want to make things easy on our sewing machine whenever we can. I've already stacked up the rows I'm sewing so I can do this chain piecing and keep bits and pieces going from my project, one right after the other. Don't have to do a lot of stopping and starting to snip threads. But here you can see that scrap crazy leader ender block that I use when I am chain piecing. And this is a fairly small quilt. It's going to be a lap or a small twin size quilt. So across the center, I'm putting this quilt on point. So these rows will actually lay diagonally across my quilt. And I can, once we get everything together, we can discuss that part. So as I said, the idea of chain piecing is just, you know, running multiple units through your sewing machine at one time, so that you don't have to mess with the presser foot and cut your threads. Sometimes, depending on the fabric you're using and the piecing, you can feed your fabric in without even lifting the presser foot. But because I have some of these narrow seams right near the edge of my block, I do want to lift up the presser foot to make sure that that fabric doesn't get turned the wrong way as I'm starting out on that block. And I've had some questions about what skill level you need to be to make this quilt. This is certainly a confident beginner pattern, as long as the trick comes from the cutting, which I showed in a previous video. So here you can see my dancing row, and I need to put one more yellow square on to finish that row. So I was saying, you know, confident beginner level, and if you're a more experienced quilter, you could certainly get this quilt done in just a few sessions. It's a great scrap buster for all those 9-patch centers. You can use up your scraps there. These outer strips could also be as scrappy as you wanted to get. And your borders could certainly all be the same. I'm alternating that red with the yellow, just to give it a little more interest and something different, rather than have exactly the same colors working across my quilt. And I like to use that patriotic color scheme, especially when I'm just playing around trying something different, because then I can donate the final quilt to Quilts of Valor. I've mentioned that charity before. Forgot I had my banner back here. These are the extra blocks that will go on the end. But I'll just hang that up straight, and we will work on the on-point layout in a different session. So like I said, this sewing rows together, not a lot to talk about in terms of quilt construction, just matching up those edges. And you'll notice I'm not taking time to pin anything. Again, the fabric stays in line very easily as I'm sewing these units together. I'm not worried about anything shifting, so I don't need to pin for accuracy. If it makes you feel better, if it makes your quilts turn out better, everything all lined up, if you pin away. You can see I'm holding my fabric down as I guide it through the machine, so things are not shifting. I'm pinching that bottom corner so that stays lined up as I feed the fabric through my machine. And then that row is complete, and I can leapfrog here with my next row that only had the center rows have 5 blocks across, and then the next row only has 3 blocks across. So as I said, this quilt goes together very, very quickly with that on point layout. When I first tried this quilt years ago, I had a clown fabric for the center and just some fun multicolored polka dots and different fabrics that I used in the borders to make that dancing quilt. And it was just a really fun, you know, small size quilt, perfect for a child's quilt, either a baby crib size or even a little bit larger as a play mat size, you know, toddler carry around blanket. So we have our second row, and I'll find my last row of blocks here, just making sure I get the edges lined up before I run that through the machine. Next row. Okay, and this is where I need one of my I've got scraps everywhere. I guess we'll do 2 old scraps to start a new crazy quilt block. Just run those through the machine. Some people use, and I had for a while, a just a single fold of fabric that they run through the machine multiple times as their spacer whenever they didn't have a new unit ready to sew. If you have a small project, you know, if I had my 2.5-inch squares ready to sew more scrappy 9 patches together, I grab an old plastic bucket and keep scraps in there. I'll keep the triangles that I trim off bindings and make a bunch of half square triangles from those triangles and turn those into a scrappy quilt someday. And here we have the problem. My machine isn't wanting to advance this corner of the fabric with that seam there, so I'm just going to turn it over and pull on the threads at the back of my needle and just get that fabric feeding there with the feed dogs under my machine. Okay, so take my scrappy bits, find another piece of fabric. I'll give this a quick finger press. And I'm working with kind of a log cabin feel. So I'm going to put that other fabric on a corner for my scrappy crazy quilt blocks. And there we have the 4 main rows together that I need for my Dancing 9 patch. Next step is to press these blocks. I'm not going to finger press all of these. I'm at the stage where I want to go over to my ironing board and press my blocks. But what I'm going to need to do is alternate the seams. And the way I do that is, these are all symmetrical blocks, I'm thinking in my head. I've done a trick with other quilts where I needed to keep track of rows, and I would put different numbers of pins in the left-hand block. If I had one pin, I knew I pressed towards the pin. If there were 2 pins, I pressed away from the pins. Excuse me. That would mean my seams are going in different directions and I could allow them to nest, and my patchwork is going to lay much flatter. But since I have 2 of the same strips, yellow, red, yellow, it doesn't matter which way I press. I can just, if I press them both the same direction, you just turn one around, they'll be opposite, and I can nest the seams together. So I was going to show you a fancy trick and overthought myself. So I will take these to the ironing board, and I will be back tomorrow, and we can put this whole thing together. You can see the on-point layout. As I'm thinking about the actual layout I want to use, I'm going to have to add my setting triangles. So I'm going to go do my homework, figure out the math and the cutting for those triangles, and be back with that step of the process tomorrow. So these are just all the little things I do when I'm designing, when I'm putting together an original quilt. I'm not following a pattern, I'm making it up as I go. If you would like to see the pattern when it's eventually finished, please join my email list at truebluequilts.com. And every week I send out a newsletter that helps you enjoy, experiment, and excel as you quilt. Thanks so much for joining me on this quilt journey. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.